Good morning. We are in our last couple of weeks for this summer semester. And Lord willing, this morning we're going to be talking about budgeting, which I'm sure is most of your favorite subjects. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then Wednesday, Scott McAfee will be teaching, and specifically that focuses on training our children as it regards to finances, which, again, I don't know your personal experience. Some of that's done very proactively in some homes. Some of it's done just sort of by osmosis. You watch, and some of it is completely ignored. And so, obviously, I am of the opinion that training children younger about finances is more beneficial. So Scott will be dealing with that. And then, again, Lord willing, next week, John Christian is going to sort of put a bow on all of this. So it'll be fun to see how he does that. We've covered a lot of information. As Bill Hodges said at the beginning when we were recruiting teachers, he said, you're biting off a lot there, Andy. There's a lot to cover. So, but it's been a good discussion, I think, for the semester. I will remind us of one thing, is that this is never, like any of these classes, any sermons, any of the work that we're trying to do, it's never the end-all of any subject, right? So this summer, we've touched a lot of things, maybe stuff that helped educate you, maybe stuff that spurred you to take action or to think more deeply about some of these things, maybe change your focus, your priority. But the real nitty-gritty work is like day in and day out, coming along beside people, helping them understand, helping them get educated on these matters, as well as just working on the discipline and self-control it takes to be a steward of the things God has given us. And then one last thing, and I don't know that this statement's been made, but stewardship and being frugal are not the same thing, right? Sometimes, unfortunately, as soon as you say stewardship, you think, well, got to stop spending, which might be part of stewardship. And I would argue that for most Americans, we could do a little less spending. But stewardship is doing with the master's things what he wants. And God is not frugal. So there are times when stewardship is being very, very, very generous. Right? So I don't want us to get those stewardship and being, I'll use the common word, cheap. Stewardship and being cheap are not the same thing. Sometimes being a good steward does mean you need to be cheap. But oftentimes, it's being very, very generous. John?
It's only one facet.
It's only one facet, yeah. It's only one piece of it. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into our subject for this morning. And I sent a few questions yesterday, not that everybody checks their email regularly. Speaking of email, I spent 30 minutes this morning going through email, specifically my junk email box, because for some reason, about 60% of anybody sending an everyone email goes to my junk. And it's like 800 emails, and I'm scrolling through to find the 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. So just on a personal note, if I don't respond to something, or if there's something I seem oblivious to, it's probably went out on the one reason could be it went on the everyone email, and I just didn't see it. So I apologize for that. I'm trying to get it fixed. Okay, what is budgeting? We talk about money. What's budgeting? There's no wrong or right answers. There's some answers better than others. Yes, ma'am. Allocating funds to be used for different purposes. Okay. Anybody else want to add to that? Go ahead. Telling your money what to do. Right? Right. So there's an intention to it, right? There's an intention. There's a prioritization that takes place. There is self-control that's involved. Connie? Yeah, a lot of times, and thank you, Connie, for bringing that up, a lot of times the word budget gets used or gets introduced or gets focused on because we're recognizing that every month we've got less than we spent. So what's going out is more than what's coming in, and that causes problems, right? Especially if you have a few months in a row where you do that. Where do we usually put the difference? On a credit card, which I could spend hours and hours about how dangerous that can be, right? But we budget a lot of things. We may not recognize it, but we budget our time, we budget our resources, we budget our energy, our emotions. It's any time you're putting something intentionally in one area, right? So that idea is I'm being intentional with whatever it is. In this case, we're talking about our finances. Now, let me ask you this. Does budgeting, and I don't need to see hands, I just want you to think about it. But when I talk about financial budgets, is your initial reaction positive, negative, or neutral? And I'm not asking you to share. If you want to, feel free to share. Yes, thank you. Very helpful. Peanut gallery. Just manage the slides, buddy. No. Mike? Stressful. Yeah, a negative feeling. Stressful. Why, Mike? Do you mind sharing why that might be the case?
Well, because if we don't do a budget, I think I've got all the things in the world. And so it's like I'm almost blind to what we have to spend our money on versus what we're getting. And that gives me that very cold bucket of water reality that says, hey, you're spending your money that's not, you're spending money you don't have. That's why, as you said, your credit card's going up a little bit. Maybe not a lot, but really,
Yeah, so well, I won't comment on that yet. What other thoughts? Positive, negative, neutral? You want to share why? Steve?
when our son Kyle got his first job out of college, it was with AbbVie, and it was up in Chicago. And he commented back, he said, you know, I thought I was making a decent salary until I did my budget and see where everything goes. And so it's,
Yeah. I thought I was making a decent salary, right? So, and that all depends. So, for example, and you don't need to raise your hands. I want you, again, just a thought exercise. How many people think that 6 figures, 100,000 or more, is a good salary? Okay. Do you realize if you make 100,000, let's say around 100, even up to $200,000 in San Francisco, you are basically living as if you were in Indiana on $25,000 a year. So you can make a good salary, but then just basic costs of living. I mean, I know someone who has a 800 square foot apartment in San Francisco and they pay $4,000 a month for it. I'll let you all recover from that statement. Okay? So here's the, and I know we've hinted at this. Oh, sorry, I'll ask again. Any other thoughts on just budgeting? Positive, negative, or neutral? Is it, we've heard from a couple of the negatives. Oh, Jeff.
it's not a negative.
Okay, good. Well, if anybody loves budgeting, get ready to comment. Go ahead.
It's promoted as providing freedom, but it feels very constrained.
Yes, that's again, we're going to get to that a little bit here in a minute. So, yeah, it's promoted as if, oh, you want to have freedom, you want to be in control of your finances and all these things, which I agree that ultimately that's where we're going. But man, it feels like you're putting the handcuffs on. You're putting rules in place. That terrible self-control type of thing gets in there, right? Sort of to Mike's point, like if I don't think about it, I got all the money in the world. I saw Steve Prezoon and I saw Nicole and then Mark. Steve. Sorry, for those of you who can't hear as well, a cash flow basis, if they had cash, they let it flow. I added the inflection. Yeah, so from Steve's comment, and I think this is very common, right? Where when you're in a state of no budget and spending, then putting constraints on that can be it can feel like a very negative experience. But when you're beyond that, and it does provide a feeling of security and peace and those things, it can be something that's that people approach very positive. Like you actually really get excited about looking at, and I'm not teasing, get excited about looking at the budget and seeing, wow, we spent $50 less in this category this month because we were, and there's some energy behind that, right, Nicole? Yeah, and and God teaches that, right? That's a pretty strong scriptural principle, is that we think that just doing whatever we want is freedom, but we pay eventually in all areas of our life when we don't have self-control, when we're not doing the things that we should be doing with the various resources we have. Where once we have that kind of control, there actually is a freedom there that we're not always recognize in the beginning. Mark? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Luke, I think, before I go on.
I guess just, I haven't heard it usually yet. It's just a paradigm that you elect to operate within.
Right.
The things that accompany it is where you add some space.
Yeah.
It involves discipline in order to function properly. If you have a partner or someone else, that necessitates communication on a regular basis.
Yeah, so here's where we're going to get to quickly, okay? And I know we've talked about this a little bit, but there is a certain stigma, there's a certain level of potentially shame, embarrassment around finances, right? There is. And I've had quite a bit of experience working as a Christian with other Christians with their finances, and there's almost always, it's like a man admitting that he has an addiction to pornography, right? It's one of those things that usually goes unsaid, and it's a problem that festers for a really long time before, and usually only is brought out when there's no other course of action, right? So we've got to think about finances, and as we get to budgeting, we're talking about having self-control and intention with our finances. We've got to think of it somewhat in those terms of that area that can be very beneficial and fruitful in the kingdom, but also can be a real source of shame and embarrassment. It's sort of, I jokingly say these things, but Mike already brought it up. Why do we not like budgeting? One of the reasons is we don't want to know how bad the problem is. Why have I not gotten on the scale since COVID? There's a reason. I have indications that my weight has gone up. But I haven't stepped on the scale to confirm or deny that hunch that I have, right? But it's money problems, finances are often the same way. We sort of just ignore it. We don't want to look at it, okay? Budgeting is a step in trying to gain some control, trying to have awareness of the situation, and then put things in place to help manage it as opposed to having it manage you. Okay. Now, having said that, who needs a budget? Everybody. First, I'll say it's not. There, I looked through Scripture. There's concepts of budgeting, but there's no command that says you need to have a monthly fiscal budget where you're evaluating it. And when I say the word budget, most of us have in our mind exactly what I'm thinking or what you're thinking, right? Some of you might have a very detailed balance sheet. You know, if you've got any kind of accounting background, you have a very detailed balance. Some of you might have much less. It might just be more, I understand I have this much in fixed expenses. My point is we may not even be speaking exactly the same language when we say, do you have a budget? Do you need a budget? Who needs a budget? Here's the answer to that. Most anybody, regardless of income level or expenses, would benefit from some kind of budget. Managing something, okay, just in general, managing anything usually works better when you are aware of the details of what you're managing, right? So if you're managing finances, knowing what's going out and what's coming in and having some regular check-in with that is a good principle to be a good manager. Having said that, though, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that you're going to be in financial ruin if you don't have a strict budget. Okay? Yeah, some of you, based on what you know about my background, Christine and I do not have a tremendously strict budget. We have a budget, and we do a periodic evaluations and truing up and all those accounting principles that are good, and we know where we're at. But we have had in the past a strict budget. But the reality is it's a little bit different for everybody. And even what I think is best for me may not be best for you and vice versa. For instance, and I'm going to be very careful with this, Christine and I spend a lot of money on credit cards. And we've never paid a penny of interest. We do that because, one, we've proven that we're disciplined. Two, there's some benefits financially to doing that, using somebody else's money and getting their points and some of that stuff back for normal expenses. But we are extremely diligent to know what's going on the credit card and to pay it off every month. We've never paid a penny of interest. I would never give that advice to somebody who's struggling financially. Never. Right? So, and my point for that is just that there's different approaches. So as we go into this, we're going to talk, and you're going to hear different ideas and different perspectives. The default is everybody needs a budget, and some of us would even say it needs to be a very strict budget. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not. And so I don't want you, if you come out of today and if you feel beat up that you need a budget, well, let's talk about it one-on-one. You might need one, but I don't want you to feel like, you're just a terrible person, terrible steward. No, there's all sorts of solutions to help us get to our goal, what is our goal? Think about it quickly. What is our goal with finances? Glorify God, right? To glorify God, to do with our things what God would have us to do. Now we look in Scripture like Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28. Remember Paul says, let him who steals steal no longer, but he should work so that he can pay his bills and have a good vacation. He should work so that he has money and that he can actually share. Right? So we see even in the purpose of work is there's this idea of sharing. We see in 1 Timothy chapter 6, the instructions to the rich to be ready to share. Titus talks about how God redeemed for himself a people ready or eager for good works. Right? We understand that there are things that take money outside of just our normal living expenses where God wants us to be able to use the fruit of our labor in order to do work in the kingdom, to build up others, to support others, to share, to be kind, to be generous. Well, I would argue that it's hard to do that and to be ready to do that if we have no idea of what's coming in and what's going out. Right? But again, I don't want us to fall into this trap of saying budgets are God commanded. And I know we won't say those words, but that could be our attitude. Looking absolutely down on and negative to people who may not approach their finances exactly like that. It's a good tool. It's good advice. I think it's sound advice. We'll even see from Scripture. But again, there's all different ways to apply it. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so let's ask this question. How common do you think budgets are? You know I love statistics. So this is from 2020. What percent of households do you think have a budget? 5%? That's what we feel, right? But this is the nuance to that. There are two sources I looked at from about the same time period. One said 55% of households have a budget, and another said 74% of households have a budget. Baby boomers are actually less likely than millennials to have budgets. Did you know that? Get a grip, baby boomers. I'm just saying. I know how you think of millennials. But I'm stoking fires, aren't I? But here's the thing. Having a budget and sticking to a budget are two different things, isn't it? Right? Because then when they go down in deep questions, have you ever exceeded your budget? How often do you exceed your? Then it drops to those numbers that we're thinking where we start saying, only 5%. No, most people have a budget or at least one time have had a budget. And most people feel a sense of social pressure to answer, yes, I have a budget when asked. because it sounds unconscionable to say, no, I have no idea what I spent last month, and I have no idea what I'm going to spend next month, and who knows? So far, everything's worked out, right? But having a budget and then sticking to it are two different things. Okay, and then generally, let me ask this. What areas of a budget are generally overspent? Who said that? Food. Groceries was number one. This is where I start to get a little irritated with surveys like this. What was number two? Dining out. It's the same budget line. It should be anyway, for the most part. What is your monthly food expenses? Groceries and dining out, and combined, that was like 78%. Okay? Groceries and dining out. And then what do you think, we've already talked about this, but what do you think happens when somebody has a shortfall? Goes on credit cards. So people who don't have a budget or don't stick to their budget by their own admission are most likely, or very heavily likely, to have $5,000 or more in credit card debt. Okay? So again, this is all common sense type stuff, but the idea is very simple. If you don't know what's coming in, or you don't know what's going out, or both, it's almost just by luck or maybe like some spidey sense, or you just make a ton of money and you live a pretty ordinary life. That happens too. But there's always this opportunity for us to be able to do less, for us to have less time, for us to have less resources, for us to have more stress. I mean, there's all these, what do I want to say, this momentum that happens that can cause a lot, take our energy, our time, our stewardship, and focus it on survival as opposed to actually working and thriving and being ready for good works, right? So there's sort of the setup. Let's start with this. I asked you to find, what does the Bible say about budgeting? Did anybody find anything? What passages come to mind? Do you have one that comes to mind immediately when we think about what the Bible says on budgeting? Connie? Yeah, let's turn there real quick. 1 Corinthians 16. I hope that was one that a lot of you thought of immediately. 1 Corinthians 16. Real quick on the context, we know that Paul is taking up a collection. We can see in a few chapters earlier about his encouragement for them to be ready. And we see in 2 Corinthians where Paul really gets into detail about them preparing this gift. So they're taking up the collection for a previous promised giving that they're going to do. And look at 1 Corinthians 16. We'll go ahead and start in verse 1. Now, concerning the collection for the saints, now I want us to keep that in context. That's the collection for the saints is a very specific need that he has. It's not just a general collection, but a very specific reason they're taking this up. As I ordered the churches of Galatia, so do you also. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper, so that no collection be made when I come. When I arrive, whomever you may approve, I will send them with letters to carry your gift to Jerusalem, and if it is fitting for me to go also, then I will go with them. Then they will go with me. So what's happening in this text? What's Paul's solution? So there's this gift for the saints in Jerusalem. There's going to be a time when he shows up. What's his instruction?
Put aside an amount on a regular frequency.
Yeah, put aside an amount on a regular frequency. That means I'm budgeting, I'm intentionally putting money here for this purpose. It's interesting, he says put aside and save. Going back to some of those statistics, what's the number one reason people state for wanting a budget or having a budget? Does anybody want to guess? Number one by far. They want to have an emergency fund, right? And unless they're intentionally putting their money where they find that the savings is one of the last things to get put in. So they want emergency fund savings for a rainy day, right? So saving, okay? Any other texts? So this is very clear, some instruction on how to, and it seems very straightforward, but I want us to look at it. Go ahead. Luke 14, what's that one, Brett? So what is the context there? Does anybody remember? Discipleship. And how does, in Jesus' language, there's something in his language, how he starts that phrase. Brett, how does he start it again?
For which of you desiring to build a tower does not first
Okay, there's something inherent in the way he said that. Go ahead, Brett.
Starting with the foundation, this is common sense.
Right.
This is not the point to make it. He's using this to drive the other stuff.
Exactly, but the way he says it is, it's like taking for granted, well, everybody knows, right? Fred, was that what you were going to, or? Obviously, yeah, that's a good word, right? Obviously. Now, I would argue that if you're building a tower, which oftentimes the tower was like in the middle of a vineyard or something like that, you can look in the history, but that just seems like a bigger project. But would you say that we always count the cost before we? Now, one reason is, now it's not that there weren't creditors back in Jesus' day, there absolutely were. But the access to money or to credit, let me use the right words, the access to credit is so much easier now than it's ever been. Now, it took a little bit after 2008, it got tightened just for a minute. I don't know if anybody was affected. I'm not asking to embarrass, but people who normally would have been approved really easily for home loans all of a sudden found that they weren't. And I mean, there were a little bit of tightening, but I did some research, and it's opened right back up. They have different names for the same things they did before 2008. That's the way financial institutions work. Not to be negative, but it is. But there is an access to money now, to debt, to unrealized money. There's an access to it now that is unprecedented. So in Jesus' day, he may have been able to say, obviously, you know. I don't know that that statement is as applicable to our culture as it was in Jesus' day, because there's a lot of individuals who they may count the cost, but in their counting the cost, they're not looking at what they have. They're looking at how much they can borrow. Now, again, there are different principles, and I'm not going to get into the weeds. I'm talking about your normal household budgets. There are self-employed people. There are situations where debt is actually a financial tool, and that can get really complicated. But for the normal household, that idea of taking on debt to finish projects is something that's very common. What's a home equity line of credit? I want a new kitchen. I don't have $40,000 to put in a new kitchen, so what do? I take out a loan against my house so I can pay for the new kitchen, and and I'm not judging whether that's right or wrong, wise or unwise. Generally, making improvements to a kitchen do increase resale value, property value. There's some judgment there. But that statement that Jesus made, which is very clearly about budgeting so you can accomplish what you set out, he states almost obviously, which I don't know, we could say that about our culture. Steve, I ran way by your hand, so go ahead.
Back when I would want to do something or buy something, and then Cindy would say, what about this? Or what about that? Or this? And I don't want to consider those things. I just want to do what I want to do. And so I say, I don't say much anymore, but I used to say, it'll work out. And when I say it'll work out, what I mean is, I don't want to consider the logic or the wisdom. And so that's not counting the cost.
Right. It reminds me of a phrase that I've had said to me, and then therefore I've said to my people. We'll be doing business reviews or business updates and planning and all, looking at all the business and what we're going to do. And I love to get to use it, and I don't ever say it as nasty as it might sound when I say it now, but hope is not a strategy. There's no evidence for why they think, just hoping that the market's going to come in 15% higher than it did last year. That's not a strategy. So no, you're not getting that budget. But yeah, it's like we don't want to, and so we're just sort of hoping and praying. Now, let me real quickly, I'll get to you in just a second, Connie. Let me real quickly, because I want to make sure. So when Jesus talks about counting the cost for the tower, right? For instance, I would argue that the majority of people in here have either have or have had a car loan in the past, okay? Sometimes you need the vehicle, you need the transportation, even a feasible, price vehicle. Sometimes people don't have $15,000, $20,000, $30,000, and that's actually doesn't get what it used to, right? I was looking at trucks the other day. We were thinking about a truck. You could spend $80,000 really quickly and just have a sort of nice truck, right? Somebody goes, yeah. Counting the cost could also be counting the cost of the payment and the down payment and the interest rate and knowing what you're going to be all in. And, yes, you're planning that you're going to continue to have the same income for each month. But that's still counting the cost. I don't want us to think that counting the cost only means, do I have the money right now to pay for it? Counting the cost is taking the whole spectrum of what's involved, right? And recognizing where there's areas of risk and where there's, I'm sort of like, it's easy to count the cost if I want the car for $40,000 and I have $40,000 in the bank. But there's other ways. I just want to be clear on that. Connie, before I go on.
I'm digressing a little bit.
Go ahead.
My brother, he was a financial person. He managed people's retirement money. But he advised me to get an equity home line of credit. And it's good. He advised me to get it when interest rates were low.
Yep.
It's not so good when interest rates go high.
Right.
So you gotta consider that. Do you have one of those?
That's part of counting the cost.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. John?
It's taking me a while to find this. I couldn't remember exactly where it was, so I had to hunt it down. But there in Proverbs 27, verse 23, it says, "Know well the condition of your flocks, and pay attention to your herds. For riches are not forever, nor does a crown endure to all generations." So it's more or less implying, be diligent of what you have.
They,
Realize what you have and take care.
so that is the last on my list that I've got big asterisks. No, that's good, because I wasn't sure if that would come to mind. I figured Luke would come to mind. I figured 1 Corinthians 16 would come to mind. There's a few other Proverbs in there. But yeah, go ahead. If you didn't hear that, go ahead and turn to Proverbs 27. Proverbs 27 in verse 23. Know well the conditions of your flocks and pay attention to your herds, for riches are not forever, nor does a crown endure to all generations. When the grass disappears and the new growth is seen, and the herbs and the mountains are gathered in, and the lambs will be for your clothing, and the goats will bring the price of a field, and there will be goat's milk enough for your food, for the food of your household, and sustenance for your maidens. So the idea is, know what you've got, so that when the lean times happen, you have what you need to continue through with life. And that, in and of a nutshell, that Proverbs 27 is the idea of budgeting, right? Knowing what you have so that you can take care of what is needed, and especially in those ups and downs of our financial lives.
Knowing the
Okay?
state of your finances.
Yeah, knowing the state of your finances.
Bring back reality real quick.
Exactly. And so and now we're going to jump into some of the more applicable stuff here in just a second with the time we have left. Here's where I want us to get to mentally, is there are all different ways to budget. There's very detailed one, and we're going to go through a few. This is not about giving you specifics I'm going to go through some basic categories, because if you Google budgeting techniques, you will find a ton of different resources. NerdWallet's actually a pretty good one. I know it sounds weird, but NerdWallet, they even have some free resources you can use. There is Money IQ, I think is what it's called. There's quite a few different, some of them absolutely are selling something, so you always got to be aware, but a lot of free advice when it comes to budgeting. There are some similar techniques. They might be named slightly different, but literally it boils down to like 4 or 5 techniques. I'll review those real quickly with you towards the end of class, just to stimulate you if you want to have somewhere to start to go look for a budget. But the most important thing to consider when we're looking at budgeting, and if we're not doing it, do we need to do it, is sort of getting to the barriers. We've hit a lot of them. What are some of the barriers to budgeting? Go ahead. Time. Yeah, you have to make the time, right? It takes time. Steve? It takes teamwork, and there's nothing that destroys a budget. If there's nothing that destroys a budget than one person, one of 2 people that are contributing to spending the household income, where one is agreeing to it and one is not, where one is being very strict in what they spend and the other is just, I mean, that's just fruitless effort, right? And so there's got to be teamwork, and sometimes that can be challenging, especially based on our backgrounds and the way we were raised and various factors, right? John?
One of the big ones, especially with worldly people, is coveting. This is mine, I work for it. I want to hang on to that.
Yeah, there can be coveting involved, absolutely. I saw one other hand, Steve, or Scott, sorry. Inflation, expound upon that a little bit.
Well, when you set a budget, you got $300 fuel for your car, and that's a month, fuel costs $330, and your budget's about.
Yeah, so especially when it's a pretty tight budget, and one category, which fuel's a great example. From month to month, you could double your fuel budget. With nothing you didn't drive anymore, it's just the economic situation we're in, boom. Food, groceries, right? So that's a barrier to it, is like why doesn't it just stay the same? So inflation or other changes can cause your budget to be all of a sudden out of whack in one category. Mark and then Scott again. Yep. Yeah, there's absolutely a fear mechanism here. Absolutely. Okay, this is why I'm getting to, if we're not budgeting, if we're sort of head in the sand, I don't need that, all the rationalization for why we don't pay attention, there could be a very heavy fear component to that as well. Did I see Mary's hand? Sorry, Mary, then Scott, and then Fred. Yes, yeah. So as opposed to seeing those different approaches as oppositions to each other, which they can be very quickly, look at them as how do they work together as strengths. Yep, absolutely. Scott, then Fred.
One of the things that I think is really problematic is the unknown, things that happen that are unknown.
Yep.
It reminds me of the story of Joseph when he was working with Pharaoh, and he interpreted a dream about the 7 lean cows and 7 full cows and 7 lean cows. And Joseph got to be put in a position where he raised money, he raised grains and food, and he stored it for the 7 lean years that were about to come.
Yep.
And that's the same thing with feeding.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll get to some of those principles here in just a second. Fred, and we've got almost 5 minutes left. Go ahead.
Barriers, I've heard some people say, well, I work an hourly job, I don't know how many hours I'm gonna get
Yep.
each week, how can I really plan on that? Or I get commission, how can I really plan on that? And sometimes, even if you have a known income and pretty stable expenses, if you know that your expenses are more than your income, it's like, why even bother?
Yeah, there's a lot of why even bother. Yeah, exactly. That's one of the most common. Okay, so 5 minutes left, so I'm going to burn through some of this information, but the idea is to just to do a little spark, and if you need help or more details, feel free to reach out to me. There's many, many others in this church family that are qualified to help in this area as well. So forgive me, and I can also email some of this if you would like it. Okay, so first of all, first step, and probably the easiest, is you got to know your income, right? Now, that's somewhat easy from a paycheck standpoint. If you're self-employed, it gets a little bit harder, but generally, we know what our monthly income is. The harder second step is to truly get a handle on your expenses. Okay, so there's fixed expenses. Quickly, what would be a fixed expense? You got rent, you got mortgage, you got a car payment, stuff that's the same amount every month regularly, right? You can even do that a little bit with utilities. It's harder because it does fluctuate, but it's a known expense. It's going to happen. You usually have a range. So a budgeting technique, you always budget at the higher end of the range, and then you're happily surprised when it comes in lower, okay? But you start with your fixed expenses. How do you get a grip on all those cash expenditures, all those, I've got my regular groceries, but ooh, that People magazine looks pretty interesting. I'm going to throw that on the cart, right? How do you do that? That's the hard part. Eric? So there's a couple of keys that you have to do no matter how you do it. First of all, you got to collect every receipt. And I would suggest you carry a little pocket notebook or use your phone, because when you pay for cash, you got to note that, and you may not have a receipt. I counsel people use the shoebox method. You carry a tiny little notebook so you can write down what you spend in cash. You take every receipt. At the end of the day, you put everything in the shoebox. Don't even look at it for a couple of months. You want more than a month. You want 2 to 3 months of gathering all your expenses. Then at the end of that, and make sure you date so you know which month goes in. But you gather all that, and it's just diligence, and you got to get into a routine, and it's going to be really frustrating for the first couple of weeks. And then after about week 2 or 3 of being in that routine, all of a sudden it becomes natural habit. That is really one of the only ways you can get a really good idea of your expenditures, because that's when you're going to find out that you spend $150 on Starbucks every month. And I've had people that's actually $5 once a day for 5 days a week is $100 a month. Okay? This is the moment that what Mike Dwyer wants to ignore. Right? Where you realize you spend a lot more than you thought. One fun exercise is for you, especially if you're married, to sit down with your spouse and guesstimate how much each category would be. You can easily download budget sheets that have all the common categories of a household spend. But that 2 to 3 months of the shoebox collecting, I just call it the shoebox, collecting every receipt, writing down every cash expenditure, is the only way to get a really good grip on an average month what is spent. Okay? Those 2 steps, knowing what your income is and knowing what's going out, are the hardest parts. Well, one of the hardest parts. The self-control is the hardest part. But once you know those, you can start then seeing, okay, where are we at and what do we need to do? Okay, now quickly, because of time, I'm going to go through, there is what's called zero-based budgeting. These go from most strict to more loose. Zero-based budget is you keep track of everything. Some of you, when I said budgeting, we're going to be 2 minutes over. Some of you, when I said budgeting, this is what you thought of. A balance sheet with every single thing. And every month, what you spend and what you make is the same. Now, when I say that's zero, it means that it didn't mean you spent your whole paycheck. Some of it went into savings, but it comes out zero. I'm just going to throw out a couple of names real quick. Pay yourself first budgeting. That's a concept where you focus on saving and reducing debt. Okay, so that, and there's concepts there. There is envelope system. Some of you Dave Ramsey people. That's a cash-based system. It's pretty complicated if in this society, especially after COVID. But the idea is you put your budgeted cash in each envelope for the categories, and once that envelope's empty, grocery money's empty, and there's 15 days of the month left, better eat what's in the pantry. It turns out those pinto beans aren't that bad, right? So there's the 50-30-20, which is where you take 50% for necessary expenses, 30% for discretionary expenses, and then 20% for savings and debt payments. You can adjust that, but the idea is you've got a purpose for where you want your money to go. Notice with any of these, you still need to know what's going in and what's coming out, right? And then last but not least, the no budget. Oh, everybody's like, that's my budget. The no budget is actually quite easy in this time, because it used to be you had to do this thing called a checkbook and all this stuff. If you do a lot of online banking, if you do a lot of, there is at a click of a finger, and this is what Christine and I do, at a click of a finger, I can see exactly what I've spent for the month. I can see exactly where things are at. And the idea is you're not sitting there and purposely putting money here or there. It's you're making sure that you're not spending more than you make on a regular basis. So about every couple of weeks, You click on your checking account, you click on these sort of things. Now, we can get into details, but my point for just quickly mentioning that is you can be as strict or as somewhat loose as you want to be and still have a budget. Still know what's coming in and what's going out. I will say this, if you have financial issues where your debt load and some of those things are so great, the stricter budget is going to be what is absolutely necessary to get you out of those kind of situations. All right, the last thing I'm going to say very, very briefly here. Just like with most of our areas of life, if we're struggling, it usually gets to a heart issue. I do not want to pretend that financial tools and education are going to solve most things. It will help, and sometimes that is the core problem. But almost always it gets down to me deciding what I'm going to do with me. And that means, am I going to submit and do the hard work to look more like Jesus, or am I going to keep giving in to all those things that are distracting me in this world? That's why I talk about it's like almost like a therapy session as much as it is a financial education session. All right, thank you for your time.